While thinking about the Testaments recently, I ended up going down a completely different rabbit hole than I expected, because for years, whenever people talked about Gilead, the conversation was always the same. The handmaids, the ceremonies, the commanders, the punishments, the brutality. And don't get me wrong, those things are horrifying. But the more I think about the Testaments, the more I feel like we're looking at a version of Gilead that's actually much scarier. Not because it's more violent, because it's smarter. And I think that's what makes wife school so disturbing. Because when you really break it down, wife school isn't a school at all. It's a factory designed to create the perfect Gilead woman. And the terrifying part is that many of the girls don't even realize it's happening. They're not dragged there. They're not forced into it kicking and screaming. They're raised to want it. And if you ask me, that's far more dangerous than anything we saw in the Handmaid's Tale. Because physical control can create resistance. Psychological control creates believers, and that's exactly what Gilead has been building. Think about Agnes, because Agnes is probably the perfect example. For most of her life, Agnes genuinely believes Gilead is normal. She believes the rules. She believes the structure. She believes the future that's been planned for her. Not because she's foolish, because that's all she's ever known. She didn't grow up remembering the old world like June did. She didn't watch society collapse. She didn't witness freedom being taken away. She was born into the cage, which means the cage feels normal. And that's one of the most frightening ideas in the entire franchise. Because if someone is born inside a system, they often don't recognize it as a system. They see it as reality. That's what Gilead understands. And that's why wife school exists. The goal isn't education. The goal is programming. That's the part that really stands out. These girls aren't learning science. They're not learning history. They're not learning critical thinking. They're certainly not learning how power works. Instead, they're taught submission, obedience, appearance, presentation, domestic skills, religious performance. Everything revolves around preparing them for a future role that has already been chosen for them. And the most important thing isn't what they're taught. It's what they're prevented from learning. Because ignorance is one of Gilead's most valuable tools. The less these girls know about the world, the easier they are to control. The less they understand alternatives, the harder it becomes to imagine freedom. And that's exactly what wife school accomplishes. But here's where things become really interesting. Because not every girl responds the same way. And that's why characters like Huldah, Shunammite, Becca, and Agnes are so important. Each one represents a different response to Gilead's conditioning. Let's start with Shunammite, because she might be the closest thing to a success story from Gilead's perspective. Shunammite embraces the system. She loves status. She loves hierarchy. She loves being seen as important. She wants everything Gilead promises: marriage, recognition, position, power. She's not fighting the system. She's thriving inside it. Or at least she thinks she is. And that's exactly why her story is so tragic. Because Shunammite genuinely believes compliance will protect her. She believes if she's loyal enough, obedient enough, devoted enough, she'll be rewarded. But Gilead doesn't actually reward loyalty. It rewards usefulness. And those aren't the same thing. The moment someone stops being useful, the system moves on. That's the lie at the center of Gilead. And Shunammite may eventually discover it too late. Then you have Becca. And Becca is fascinating because she quietly exposes one of Gilead's biggest weaknesses. She doesn't fit. No matter how hard the system tries, it can't force every girl into the same mold. Some people naturally begin asking questions. Some people naturally feel uncomfortable. Some people naturally sense that something is wrong. That's Becca. She isn't loudly rebellious. She's something far more dangerous. She's thoughtful. And authoritarian systems hate thoughtful people, because thoughtful people eventually notice contradictions. Then there's Huldah. And this is where things get really creepy, because Huldah represents something audiences don't talk about enough: the desire to belong. People often assume brainwashing only works on weak individuals. History proves the opposite. Brainwashing works best when it offers something people desperately want: community, identity, purpose, acceptance. And that's what Gilead offers girls like Huldah. It tells them exactly who they are, exactly where they belong, exactly what their future looks like. No uncertainty, no confusion, no difficult choices. Everything is decided for them. For some people, that's comforting, which is exactly why systems like Gilead can survive. Not everyone follows out of fear. Some follow because certainty feels safe. And then we arrive at Agnes, the person standing at the center of all this, because Agnes represents the moment the programming begins to fail. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, but it fails. She starts noticing things, starts questioning things, starts seeing gaps between what she's told and what's actually happening. And once that process begins, it's almost impossible to reverse. Because curiosity is dangerous. One question becomes two become 10. Eventually, the entire foundation starts cracking. And Gilead knows it. That's why information is treated like a weapon. Because it is. Now let's talk about the Pearl Girls. Because if wife school is terrifying, the Pearl Girls might be even worse. At first glance, they seem almost beautiful. Elegant white dresses, pearls, graceful behavior, permission to travel, permission to read, permission to write. Compared to most women in Gilead, they appear privileged. But that's exactly why they're so effective. The Pearl Girls are essentially missionaries, recruiters, salespeople. Their job is to sell Gilead to the outside world. Think about how insane that actually is. Gilead has become so desperate for people that it's actively marketing itself. And that's where the horror takes a completely different form, because the Pearl Girls aren't conquering anyone. They're persuading them. The strategy is brilliant, terrifying, but brilliant. They don't target powerful people. They target vulnerable people. People who feel alone. People who feel lost. People struggling financially. People searching for stability. And what do they offer? A home, a family, purpose, belonging, meaning. It's the same tactic countless real-world cults have used throughout history. The promise of certainty. The promise of community. The promise that someone finally understands you. And by the time victims realize what they've joined, it's too late. That's why the Pearl Girls are so unsettling, because they're proof that Gilead understands psychology very well. And then there's Daisy, who completely disrupts the entire system, because Daisy understands something the Pearl Girls don't. She sees the illusion. She sees the performance. She sees the marketing. And her presence immediately creates tension, because systems built on narratives become vulnerable when someone arrives who knows the truth. Daisy isn't just entering Gilead. She's carrying an outside perspective into a place built on controlled information. That's incredibly dangerous. Not because of weapons, because of ideas. And that's really the heart of this entire topic. Ideas. Not violence. Not war. Ideas. The Testaments constantly asks a fascinating question. What happens when an entire generation is raised inside propaganda? Can they still recognize truth? Can they still resist? Can they still choose differently? And surprisingly, the answer seems to be yes. Because no matter how carefully Gilead designs wife school, cracks still appear. Agnes questions. Becca questions. Others question. The programming isn't perfect, and that's what gives the story hope. But here's what I think is the most disturbing realization. Gilead learned from its mistakes. That's what wife school proves. The original system relied heavily on force, public punishment, fear, violence, control. And while that worked temporarily, it also created resistance. People fought back. People escaped. People rebelled. So Gilead adapted. Instead of controlling adults, it focused on shaping children. Instead of demanding obedience, it cultivated belief. Instead of forcing loyalty, it manufactured it. And that strategy is far more effective, at least in the short term. That's why I genuinely believe wife school is scarier than the Handmaid system, because it's harder to identify. The Handmaid system looks evil. Everyone can see it. Wife school hides behind smiles, flowers, ceremonies, friendships, tradition. It disguises itself as opportunity, as privilege, as protection, which makes it infinitely more dangerous. And maybe that's why Huldah works so well as a symbol for this topic, because when people look at Huldah, they don't necessarily see fear. They see a girl trying to fit in, trying to succeed, trying to find her place. But that's exactly how systems like Gilead operate. They convince ordinary people to participate, not because they're monsters, because they're human, because they want acceptance, because they want certainty, because they want to belong. The more I think about it, the more I believe that's what the Testaments is really about. Not just resistance, not just survival, not even just Gilead. It's about the battle for the next generation. The battle over who gets to shape how young people see the world. Because once you control that, you control almost everything. And Gilead knows it. That's why wife school exists. That's why the Pearl Girls exist. That's why reading is restricted. That's why information is controlled. Everything comes back to shaping belief. And yet, despite all of that effort, despite all of that planning, despite all of that manipulation, the system still isn't winning because people continue asking questions. People continue noticing contradictions. People continue searching for truth. Agnes does. Daisy does. Becca does. Others do too. And that's what makes the Testaments so fascinating. The story isn't really about whether Gilead can control people. It's about whether people can remain themselves after years of being told who they're supposed to be. And maybe that's why Wife School feels so horrifying. Not because it's full of violence, because it's full of smiles, because it looks harmless, because it disguises oppression as opportunity. And sometimes those are the systems that become the most dangerous of all.